We're going to start right in verse 1, and it starts out, and now, O priests, this command is for you. And when it specifically addresses the priests, remember the priests were a division of the Levites. There were 12 tribes of Israel. This information like this is going to become much more important in chapter 3. But the priests, every priest was a lineal descendant of Abraham. Every single priest was a lineal descendant of not Abraham, Aaron, of Aaron. And so these priests were the de facto leaders. Remember that Israel was without a king for centuries, and then they had kings, and now by the time of Malachi, they're under Persian rule. The country of Israel doesn't have a king of its own. It has a Persian governor, but the priests basically were kind of running the place. So he says, this, O priest, this command is for you. Then God's expecting this from his leaders. And of course, that's you and I in the body of Christ. We want to step forward and lead. And so in verse 2, he says, if you will not listen, and if you will not take it to heart to give glory to my name, says Yahweh of armies, then I will send a curse against you, and I will curse your blessings. Indeed, I've cursed them already because you do not lay it to heart. And so there's something in here about the fact that God wants particularly his leaders to glorify him, to live in a way that glorifies him. And this is going to show up a number of times in Malachi. And it's something that we want to do. And living in a way that glorifies God is a choice. You know, we can make that choice, and you decide to do certain things and decide to not do certain things, and it's a choice to glorify God. And that's why he says, if you will not take it to heart to give glory to my name. And then it says, I will send the curse against you. It's important. It's not a curse. It's the curse. Okay, so what's going on here? Why is it saying I will send the curse against you instead of a curse against you? And the answer is that the curse was promised to people who didn't listen. So let's go to Deuteronomy. We'll be right back here in Malachi, but let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 28. And it starts out with a blessing, and I love that it's going to start with a blessing. Let's give people a chance to get on the right foot. Verse 1, if you will listen, yes, listen to the voice of Yahweh your God, to be careful to do all his commandments that I command you this day, Yahweh your God will set you on high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings will come on you. So then he goes through verse 3, blessed you will be in the city. Verse 4, blessed will be the fruit of your womb, and so forth. And then you get down to verse 15. But if you will not listen to the voice of Yahweh your God by being careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you this day, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. And then he goes through a whole big list of curses. So there was the blessing and there was the curse. And so going back to Malachi chapter 2, then he says, if you really honestly, as the leaders, as the priests, aren't going to glorify my name, then what's going to happen? Then the curse will come upon you. By the way, and I will send the curse is the idiom of permission. It's not that God sends a curse on people that don't obey him. You know, it's what happens is God, he has to be a righteous God. So if he's going to protect us, then we have to do something that warrants that protection. And if we stand against God, then what happens is we tie God's hands. And the adversary is always, what's it say in 1 Peter 5:8? That the adversary is roaming the earth seeking people to devour. Well, who can he devour? He can devour those people who walk away from God. That's also going to come up in chapter 3. God says, return to me and I will return to you. He doesn't say, I will return to you and then you can return to me. He's already returned to us. He's already extended blessings. He's already made promises. So God, as the perfect Father, has led out And then he says, okay, so walk in on that, return to me, and then I can truly bless you. And like I say, this is going to come, later when we get to chapter 3. But the point I wanted to get away from, or make sure that we all understood, is that God's not up in heaven looking down on people and getting really upset with them if they don't obey him, don't listen to him, don't glorify him, just so he can smite them or something. That's not God. He's doing his best to protect us, but he can't protect us if we walk away from him. And then in verse 3, the REB, behold, I will rebuke your arm and will spread dung on your faces. Now, the word arm, depending on the way it's vowel pointed, can be seed. And most of the versions will go with, I will rebuke your seed and will spread dung on your faces. But I think there's good argument and some good English versions that have gone with arm. The Septuagint uses arm. The Latin Vulgate, when Jerome was translating it from the Hebrew text that Jerome was using, he translated it as arm. So there's good evidence from early texts that it probably read arm. Now, why would the Bible say, you're the priests? Why would the Bible say, I'll rebuke your arm? Well, the priests were always doing things like raising their arms and blessing people. And that's a lot of their job, was to bless people, pray people, lift up offerings. Remember, you had the heave offering, which was heaved up and down and stuff like that. So God is like, he's done with the priests. They have rejected him. We will read about all kinds of horrible things they did. God had rejected the priests. He wasn't going to accept their offerings. I believe here the proper translation is arm. You're going to have people that would argue with that. Okay, we there's evidence for both sides. I just think arm is the better translation. Seems to fit better in the context and stuff. And I've got commentary on that in verse 3 if you want to read the REV commentary on verse 3. So he says, behold, I will rebuke your arm and will spread dung on your faces. Now that's that's pretty graphic, to be honest. When you think about the way the sacrifices were done, for God to say, I will spread dung on your faces, it's really graphic, and it shows you that God is really just kind of done. He's over these priests that won't worship him. And again, there's a lot of commentary on this that, if we don't serve God, God doesn't accept our sacrifices and prayers, that kind of thing. Then there's this interesting little phrase, behold, I will spread dung on your faces, the dung of your feasts. Wait a minute, the dung of your feasts. What are the feasts? Well, the three primary feasts were the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And so when these are the three main feasts, although there were other minor feasts as well, but the feasts were primarily to worship God. Remember, it was 3 times a year that the Israelite males came to Jerusalem to worship God. And so here's these feasts that are designed so that God is glorified and God is worshiped, but because of the ungodliness of the priest, God says, I'm going to turn it around. And you don't come here to bless me, so I'm not going to bless you. I'm going to spread dung on your faces, the dung of your feasts. And then he makes a very powerful and important statement, and you will be taken away with it. And if we really understand this, it helps us to understand the whole tabernacle and temple process, and it helps us to understand where Jesus Christ was crucified. So let's go to Leviticus, because the question is, when it says that the priests, people with dung, the unclean things are going to be taken away, then what's it talking about? Taken away where? Let's go to Leviticus chapter 4. And when you read about the offerings, Leviticus chapter 4 is about the sin offering. And remember that 2 Corinthians 5 says that Jesus Christ was made a sin offering. And that's important. By the way, a lot of the versions just say that he was made sin for us, like the King James Version. It's the same word in the Greek that's used throughout the Septuagint for the sin offering. Christ wasn't made into sin. How can a person be made into sin? Christ was a sin offering. That becomes important as this develops. So Leviticus 4, you've got a sin offering. And by the time you get to verse, say, 8, the two kidneys, the fat that's on them, that's by the loins, the appendage on the liver, with the kidneys he's to remove, just as he removed it from the bull for the sacrifice of peace offerings. The priest is to burn them into smoke on the altar of burnt offering. So the altar was to burn up some of the sin offering. Some of it was eaten and that kind of thing. Verse 11, but the bull's skin, all its flesh with its head and with its legs, its innards, we call that the guts, and its dung. Verse 12, even all the rest of the bull, he's the priest that's officiating, must carry outside the camp. And of course, he's not going to carry it all, but he's in charge of making sure that other priests and Levites carry the stuff. So he's going to carry it outside the camp to a clean place where the ashes are poured out and burn it on wood with fire. Okay, now we think you take a bull, it's got pounds and pounds and pounds of guts. And you're not just going to throw it on the ground. You're going to burn them up. And to burn it up, then there's going to, you can't, I'm sure that many of you have been Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, camping, something or other, and tried to start a fire in the woods. And you can't just lay wood on the ground and burn it. It needs to get air, and usually we do that by putting some kind of grate or getting something underneath that allows air to come up. So if they're going to burn, think about how many offerings there are. You know, my gosh, just on a regular day, you have the morning offering, you have the evening offering. So there's 2 dead animals just on that day. On the Sabbath, those were doubled, 2 in the morning, 2 in the evening. And then here comes somebody who sinned and he's got a sin offering. Here's somebody who's feeling guilty and he's got a burnt offering. And here's somebody else and he's overstepped some law and he's got a trespass offering. And you got all these guts that you got to burn up. And how are you going to do it? And it says you go east of the, well, it doesn't say here that you go east, but it says you go to the clean place where the ashes are poured out and you burn it with wood on a fire. It is, and then it commands, it is to be burned where the ashes are poured out. And we learned from Jewish history that that was east of the temple. And remember, the tabernacle and temple faced east. So they kill these animals, and then they take the guts to the east to a place that's designated where all the ashes from the other altars are poured out. And that's where you're going to set up some kind of grate, if you will. And this is not named, it's not called an altar in the Old Testament, but it's called an altar in the New Testament. So they burn up all these animals on the east. Now, what are they burning up? They're burning up the unclean things. Okay, now we go forward to Hebrews. Hop forward to Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews 13, last chapter in the book of Hebrews. And in verse 10 of Hebrews 13, it says, we have an altar. Okay, now this is to the Hebrews. The Hebrews are Christian. So we includes you and I. So you and I have an altar from which those who serve in the tent have no right to eat. Wait a minute now. So the tabernacle system, the temple system has 3 altars. It's got the altar of burnt sacrifice, the big, huge altar. It's got the golden altar of incense, where the incense was burned inside the holy place, the main outer room of the temple. And you've got this altar on the east side of the temple. We learned from the mission of the Gemara, we learned from some of the Jewish writings that at the time of Christ, what was directly east of the temple in Jerusalem? Yeah, exactly. Thanks, John. Read your lips. The Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is exactly east of the temple in the New Testament. And so where were the ashes poured out and where were those things burned? They were burned on top of the Mount of Olives. The unclean things were burned on top of the Mount of Olives. Jesus Christ, it says in 2 Corinthians 5, is a sin offering. Also, we know that human beings are unclean things. That's why you can't sacrifice, you could not legitimately sacrifice a human being to Yahweh. A human being is unclean. Yahweh would not accept that kind of offering. So we have an altar from which those who serve in the tent have no right to eat. The who serves in the tent, the Levites and the priests. Why can't they eat there? Because that's where the unclean things are burned up. Verse 11, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned outside the camp. Verse 12, for this reason, Jesus, who was unclean, also suffered outside the gate so that he would make the people holy through his own blood. So here's a verse that's telling us that Jesus was unclean and he suffered, and this is our altar, and it would be on top of the Mount of Olives. And this is then more evidence. There's other evidence as well, and there's commentary on this in the REV, but this is the altar that was east of the temple at the time of Christ, giving evidence that Christ was crucified on top of the Mount of Olives. Let's go back to Malachi then. So when it says in verse 3, I will rebuke your arm, you're not going to be able to raise your hand and bless people. I won't honor that. I'm going to spread dung on your faces, the dungs of the feasts in which you're supposed to be honoring me, and you will be taken away with it. They'll be unclean once they get dung on their faces, and they'll be carried out with all the rest of the unclean stuff. Verse 4, you will know that I've sent this commandment to you, that my covenant with Levi may stand, says Yahweh of armies. Now, verse 4, this covenant with Levi, God never made a covenant with the man Levi. Levi was the fourth son of Jacob, and God didn't ever make a covenant with him. He went down into Egypt with his brothers and lived and died in Egypt. So what's going on here? Here, my covenant with Levi now is standing for his descendants. So he could say, my covenant with the Levites may stand, but there's an important truth buried in here, because he could have said, my covenant with the Levites, and he doesn't. He says, my covenant with Levi. And one of the things we learn from reading the Old Testament, that oftentimes God looks at certain groups as a whole. And we know he looks at nations that way. That's why if a nation sins like the Canaanites, you might have a righteous people, some righteous people in there, but the whole nation suffers. We see that with modern nations. If the leadership of a modern nation is ungodly and terrible, the entire nation will suffer. And so God's saying, I made a covenant with Levi. And basically, as far as we can see, that covenant was made in Exodus chapter 32, verse 29. So if you want to take a quick hop to Exodus chapter 32, verse 29, what's going on in Exodus chapter 32? The children of Israel are at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses has gone up Mount Sinai. He's going to be up there for 40 days and 40 nights. The children of Israel get antsy, and they go to Aaron, and Aaron makes a golden calf and leads the nation into sin. And Moses wants some people that'll stand up for Yahweh, and the Levites do. And what they do was a godly thing, a gory thing. It's one of those things that you just hate to see, but it speaks to how decisive you have to be sometimes in order to keep a nation godly. This is something that as a nation we've pretty much gotten away from. There's a lot of people that I think, for example, should be convicted of treason. And if you want to have a godly nation and keep it a godly nation, you need to make that a fair and just decision. But then at that point, you need to protect your nation. We used to have a death penalty for treason. So here's the children of Israel. They had just, this is Exodus 32. In Exodus 24, 40 days earlier, maybe a little more than 40, 42, 45, they had made a covenant with Yahweh that he was going to be their only God. Now, 40 days later, Aaron and they're being led into idolatry, and they've made a golden calf. And so, verse 26, when Moses came down the mountain, verse 26 of Exodus 32, he said, "Whoever is on Yahweh's side, come to me." All the sons of Levi gathered to him. I don't know what happened to the rest of the tribes, but for some reason, the tribe of Levi said, "Hey, we're in. We don't like this golden calf thing. We're in." And verse 27, he said to them, "This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says." That's important because people could look at this record and say, Moses is angry, Moses is vindictive. But this is a command. What we're going to read here is a command of Yahweh. This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. He said this to those Levite men. "Every man put his sword on his thigh and go back and forth from gate to gate throughout the camp, and every man kill his brother, and every man his neighbor, and every man his relative." The sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. And that's, a horrific scene, but it shows, this is what's going to happen at the end times when Christ comes back. Isaiah chapter 11 is very clear. It's going to be the breath of Christ's mouth, or the sword that comes from Christ's mouth, that will kill the wicked. And a wicked person is a wicked person, whether they're your relative or not. And so, because of that action, verse 29, Moses said, "Today he's talking to the Levites, "today you have been ordained to serve Yahweh. For every man was against his son and against his brother, resulting in a blessing being put on you this day." And this is, we could compare this to Christ saying, if someone loves his father or mother more than me, he's not worthy of me. It doesn't say you can't love your mom and dad. In fact, we're supposed to honor our parents, but nothing in our world is to be honored more than God. And so here he says, today you've been ordained to serve Yahweh. And as far as we can see, that's when the Levites were chosen and ordained, and a covenant was made with them that they would then be the ones to serve God. If you go back and read Exodus 19, God wanted to have the whole nation be a kingdom of priests. That was God's desire. But, if you're not willing to walk it out, you're not willing to walk it out, and they weren't. So then God took the Levites because out of it they were faithful. Let's hop back to Malachi. So he's talking about the covenant with Levi in verse 4. In verse 5, "My covenant will be with him," again, singular, looking at the Levites as one group. "My covenant with him was one of life and peace," which, by the way, life and peace are things that you and I get and anybody else gets when you believe and obey God. And verse 5 is powerful. Watch how this develops. "My covenant with him was one of life and peace, and I gave them so he would be reverent to me." And that's so powerful that, again, God moves first. God blesses us, but he's expecting a blessing in return. So God blesses us with different things, and then he wants us to be reverent. And there's the principle in this. And of course, then he goes on to say, "And the Levites were reverent to me and stood in awe of my name." Verse 6, "The law of truth was in his mouth, and unrighteousness was not found on his lips." Now, you got to go back when the Levites were that faithful, because they taught the law, they stood with Moses and that kind of thing. Now, after Malachi, Moses was like 1450 BC, 1400 BC. This is now 400 BC. So it's been 1,000 years. So 1,000 years ago, the law of truth was in his mouth, unrighteousness was not found on his lips. What's going on now? The Levites, the priests, like in verse 2, you're not giving glory to my name. So things changed a lot in that 1,000 years. God did want to still bless them if they would speak the truth and live righteously. And I love the close of verse 6. "He," meaning the Levites, "walked with me," or lived, if you will. Walking was used of living. "Walked with me in peace and uprightness, and turn many away from iniquity. And that's a promise that, or a statement, I guess, that you and I can grab a hold of. When you set a good example for others, others pay attention. You know, oh boy, yeah, there's so many people in the world that ought to be good examples and they're not. We've got loads of Christians that, I mean, and I don't mean to be critical of anybody, but you got loads of Christians, they hardly ever, if ever, read their Bible. They get off work on a Friday and go to a local bar and get basically drunk and that kind of thing. They don't set the kind of example they should. Now, we're all struggling, nobody's perfect. Um, and so we don't want to be too hard on ourselves, but at the same time, if we understand how valuable it is to have a good example, I know you guys know this because there have been people in my life that I've really looked up to that have just really helped me transform. I all I can describe it as, it's like I used to do some rock climbing, and when you grab that next thing and pull yourself up, and you grab that next thing and pull yourself up, and you grab that next thing, and that's what people are like when they're the perfect example. That when I first, I could name names, but I don't need to. But when I first got born again, remember I was raised atheist. When I first got born again, I had people that were like, whoa, the sun rose and set on them, and I wanted to be like them. And then as I got to be more like them, there were people above them that was like, whoa, and I want to be like them. And you kind of climb yourself up, and that's what we want to be for people. We want to be those kind of people, and that's a choice. That's a choice that we make to say no to certain things and yes to certain things and be disciplined enough to do things that God wants us to do. So he says, you've turned many away from iniquity, and that's a great promise and challenge that we can do that. Verse 7, for the priest's lips should preserve knowledge. And that's really what we want to do. We want to learn stuff and then preserve that knowledge and then help people. And people should seek the law from his mouth, for he is a messenger of Yahweh of armies. And that's precisely correct. The teaching priest is a messenger of Yahweh of armies, and that's what we do. We bring God's message to people. We're ambassadors for the Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 8, unfortunately, here we go, the downhill road. But you, who's he talking to? Well, he's talking to the priests, the ones that know better and should be doing better, but they aren't. He says, but you've turned aside out of the right road. And the road, the way, the walk, these are different words used for the person's lifestyle, how they live. And the right road is the road, if you will, that God has laid out for us to walk. And he looks at the priest and he says, guys, you've turned aside out of the right road. And what's the result of that? Where if you'd have walked in truth, you'd have turned many away from iniquity. But you've turned aside out of the right road. And what's happened instead? You've caused many to stumble by your instruction. And you remember what Christ said to the Pharisees when he said, you lay burdens on people that are hard to carry, and you won't lift them with your little finger, or won't touch them with your little finger. And sometimes I look at some of the regulations that you see in some denominations and some religious groups, and it's like, wow, that's really hard stuff. And then people stumble. By the way, by your instruction can also be in the law. So in the Hebrew text, and you'll see versions that go both ways. You've caused many to stumble in the law. You've caused many to stumble by your instruction. You're going to see, both of those in the English versions, and it's both true. You can get people to, to stumble, if you will. And then so it goes on, you've corrupted the covenant of Levi, says Yahweh of armies. And then verse 9, what happens? So I in turn have made you contemptible and belittled before all the people. And again, it's not that God made them that, it's that they made themselves that. But that's the result of their action. I've made you contemptible and belittled before all people because you've not kept my ways. But you've shown favoritism for certain people in applying the law. And James spoke out against that. If you remember in the book of James, he said, you people show favoritism, and it's hard not to do it, actually. We are naturally attracted to certain types of people. And when we're naturally attracted to a person, we want to bless them, we want to help them. And I think probably you guys have all been there where there's somebody that you really like or you're really blessed with, or something moves inside you and you really want to help them, and you in our own terms would say you go out of your way to help this person. And maybe you wouldn't do the same thing for another person. And there's certain circumstances where we understand that, you go out of your way to help family and that kind of things. But if you're a teaching priest and you're showing favoritism to certain people, then that's not the way things were supposed to work. And it was upsetting God. You show favoritism for certain people in applying the law. Now, starting in verse 10, Malachi goes into this section about that gets into marriages. And the scholars universally agree that this is the most difficult section in Malachi. There's so many words in here that can be translated multiple ways. There's also syntactical structures that don't work together. There's also phrases which are never used except here, and we don't really know what they mean. What we can do is we do have a takeaway message. You can read the verses and you get a general takeaway message, which is that some of the men were apparently divorcing their wives, good Jewish women, they were divorcing their wives and marrying pagan women, and God wants there to be good, strong marriages so that there can be godly children produced. So in verse 10, he says, do not we all have one Father? And of course, that Father's God. Hasn't one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously, each person against his brother, thus profaning the covenant of our fathers? So he says, if you guys are treating each other badly, dealing treacherously, you're profaning the covenant of our fathers, which is also the covenant of the law. Verse 11, Judah has dealt treacherously and committed an abomination of Israel and Jerusalem, for Judah has defiled the holy place of Yahweh. Now, the holy place of Yahweh, it can refer to several different things, but most clearly it refers to the temple. So Judah has defiled the holy place of Yahweh. If they're marrying pagan women and they're bringing pagan gods into their culture, then that is one of the things that defiles not only the temple, but Judea and as a whole. So this says Judah has defiled the holy place of Yahweh, which Yahweh loves, and has married the daughter of a foreign god. And that's a phrase, daughter of a foreign god is a phrase that occurs only here. And so some of the scholars say it refers to a pagan woman. Some of the scholars say it refers to a pagan goddess. And we don't really know because we have nothing to compare it to and not enough context to get a really, really solid meaning. I actually think that the reason that God had it so unclear is because it refers to both. We know from Ezra and Nehemiah that the Jews were divorcing their wives and marrying pagan women. We also know that the Judeans were worshiping pagan gods and goddesses. So both of those things are true, and I think that's probably why this phrase is unique and can mean two different things. And Judah's dealt treacherously, divorcing their wives, worshiping pagan gods and goddesses. Verse 12 is for the person who does this, Yahweh will cut off from the tents of Jacob the one who wakes and the one who answers. Again, we have no idea what this is talking about. It occurs only here. I've read like 12 different commentaries on Malachi about this, and there's 12 different ideas. It's just Nobody knows who the one that wakes is and who the one that answers, but whatever they are, God doesn't like it, and he's going to cut them off. And the one who offers an offering, and obviously the context is a pagan offering, the one who offers an offering to Yahweh of armies is going to be cut off. Verse 13, and the second thing you do, you cover the altar of Yahweh with tears, with weeping and with groaning, because he no longer pays attention to your offering, nor receives it with favor from your hand. So, okay, God isn't accepting their offering anymore, but why? When they get to the altar, they're crying and crying about it, but they're not looking inside themselves to say, has God changed? No, God hasn't changed. So if God's not accepting the offerings and prayers, then who's changed? The person's changed. So here it says, you've got tears and weeping and groaning because God doesn't pay attention to your offering, doesn't receive it with favor, verse 14. And you say, why? And he says, it's because Yahweh has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth. Now, when he says he's been a witness between you, basically he's saying, I'm a witness to the fact that you have treated your wife horribly. And he goes on to say, it's because Yahweh's been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you've dealt treacherously, though she's your companion and the wife of your covenant. Because, as I know, you know that marriage was not just marriage; it wasn't just a piece of paper. In biblical times, and still today, in God's eyes, marriage is a covenant. And God says, "You Judeans, look what you're doing. You're dealing treacherously against these women." Now, in saying that, what he's saying is your wives don't deserve this. And I know there's some wives that are bad, just like there's some men that are bad. In this case, it's the men who are bad. The reason he's a witness between you and the wife of your youth is because, and you've dealt treacherously, is because you're the one who's being evil here. You're the one who's breaking the covenant. And then it goes on in verse 15, but not one has done so who has a remnant of spirit. Why one? Why did he take both? Why did he make the man and the woman into one flesh? He sought a godly seed. That's godly offspring. And there's been a truckload of psychological evaluations on children that are raised by, I guess, what they call a nuclear family, where there's a father and a mother, and the children consistently do better. They're consistently more stable. God paired the husband and wife together so there could be godly children. And if our marriages are tight, then that's what happens. He says, therefore, take heed to your spirit, which can also refer to your attitude and your thoughts, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. Verse 16, for I hate divorce, says Yahweh, the God of Israel. And this is an interesting statement. I hate divorce, says Yahweh, the God of Israel, because there are circumstances in which really divorce ends up being the only decent option. And that happened with God. He was in a marriage covenant with Israel and Judah, and then he divorced them both. Israel was carried away, never did come back. Judah, he divorced, and he talks in Jeremiah, I divorced your mother, I sent her away. So God hates it, but he recognizes that there are times when you have to do it. It's just we need to fight for our marriages as hard as we can. For I hate divorce, says Yahweh, and one who covers his garment with violence. And it's interesting that the Hebrew text apparently can go both ways, because there are versions that read this way: you cover your garment with violence. It's like when somebody looks at you, all they see is violence because it's on the outside of your garment. On the other hand, there are versions that read, they're ones who cover violence with their garments, meaning you live violently, but you cover it up so people don't see it. And it's interesting that if you look at 10 or 12 different English versions, you'll see both. You'll see versions that read, you cover the garment with violence, and you'll read versions that say you cover your violence with a garment. And actually both are true. There are people who you just look at them and you know they're bad people, they're evil people, they're hurtful people. And then there are other people that are that way, but they cover it up and you don't really see it. So he goes on in closing the verse, therefore take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. And then closing the chapter, verse 17, you have wearied Yahweh with your words. And that's an interesting statement, isn't it? That Yahweh would become wearied, but he can become wearied. And then it goes, yet you say, how have we wearied him? Again, demonstrating that there's just a lack of spiritual awareness in Israel. But this goes on today. People weary God, but they won't take responsibility for what they're doing. So God says, you've wearied Yahweh with your words. You say, how have we wearied him? By saying, everyone who does evil is good in the eyes of Yahweh, and he delights in them. Or, where is the God of justice? Now let's take those two things and unpack them. Here we are at the time of Malachi. Remember, Judah has just fairly recently returned from the Babylonian captivity. When the Babylonians conquered Judah in 586 BC, they carried the majority of the people away in captivity to Babylon. They burned Jerusalem. They burned the temple. It was a horrific time. And so the Israelites were captured by the Assyrians. The Judeans were captured by the Babylonians. And then the people didn't even get to come home until the Persians conquered the Babylonians, which again, there was more carnage in that. And then finally, the Persians allowed the Judeans to come home. By that time, we learned from secular history that there were less Judeans that actually returned to Judah than stayed in Babylon. They'd been there for 70 years and 3 generations worth. And they had jobs, they had houses, they had kids and grandkids, and they're like, you know what? I'm just going to stay here. And more of the Judeans stayed where they'd been taken captive to than actually came back to Judah. And so you're here in Judah, in Malachi, and you're looking at recent history, and it's like God's on the side of the bad guys. The Assyrians won, the Babylonians won, the Persians won. Meanwhile, the Jews are just victims, victims, victims. And you could see how a Jew would look at that and say, well, if you're an evil pagan, then you must be good in the eyes of Yahweh, and he delights in them because they're the ones that are prospering. They're the ones that are winning the war. They're the victors. We're the ones here that, our women are getting raped, our men are getting killed, our houses are being burned down. So if you look out at secular history from that kind of point of view, you could say, yeah, the people that do evil, they're the ones that must be good in the eyes of Yahweh. But in fact, what they're not doing is they're not going that extra step to say, why did the Babylonians win? Why did the Assyrians win? That kind of thing. It's like, oh, because we abandoned Yahweh. Well, yeah, that'll do it. You abandon Yahweh and that'll do it. So people could feel that way today. They could look around at the world and all of the evil people that have risen to high places in government or have authority over others, make bad decisions, that kind of thing, and say, I guess if you do evil, you must be good in the eyes of God. But it's not about that. It's about all the regular people that make up a country or whatever that have turned away from God. That's the reason that things can go downhill. And then, of course, where is the God of justice? And you can see why people would say that. They'd say, where is the God of justice? Because they would expect justice to come. But if they've been sinning and sinful and have abandoned God, they don't really want justice to come, or at least they shouldn't want justice to come. They should want to repent and get themselves right. before justice actually comes. And that's a good message we can give to our brother and sister Christians too, if they need a little help, is that, hey, let's get your life really straightened out before the Lord comes back. Because the Lord's going to come back, and the Bible makes it very clear when he's going to come suddenly and unexpectedly, and he's going to come back. And so this is continuing in Malachi. I'm looking at the time and I'm like, boy, I'd be pushed to do a really good job in chapter 3 here. So I think I'll wait on chapter